I married into a quiet life filled with routine and comfort. My husband, Rajiv, was dependable, a man of few words, but always there when it counted. He had a son from a previous marriage, Daniel, who was 19 when I entered their lives. At first, Daniel barely spoke to me, treating me more like a guest than a stepmother. I never pushed. I simply showed up, day after day, cooking meals, asking about his college classes, and offering rides when his father was busy. Slowly, the silence between us thinned. We began to share light conversations. He'd sit at the kitchen counter while I made dinner, sometimes offering to help, other times just watching. His questions shifted from polite to personal, asking how I met his father, what I did before marrying, even what music I liked. It felt good to be seen. Not as a mother figure, perhaps, but as a person. Rajiv was often away on business trips. The house would grow quiet in his absence, and in that silence, Daniel and I talked more. I never saw anything unusual in it. One evening, after his exams, Daniel brought home a small cake. "For you," he said shyly, "for helping me focus." I laughed, touched by the gesture. There was something endearing about his awkward sincerity. I didn't know how lonely he'd been until then. He had few friends, mostly kept to himself. I became the one person he opened up to, and I wore that trust like a badge. His moods changed after that. He began dressing better, spoke with more confidence, and even teased me occasionally, gentle jokes that made me smile more than they should have. But I dismissed those feelings. I told myself this was what families were meant to become: close, trusting, comfortable. One night, as we cleaned the dishes together, he said, "You're the only one who really listens to me." I felt a warmth in that moment, the kind that comes from being truly appreciated. It didn't feel dangerous then. It just felt nice. Rajiv remained distant, often preoccupied with work. He rarely asked how things were at home. I became the bridge holding the household together, keeping things smooth, warm, and functional. Daniel, in his quiet ways, kept leaning on that bridge. There was no reason to question the ease between us. After all, we were just two people trying to understand each other, shaped by shared space and circumstance. Then came a moment that gave me pause. Daniel complimented my perfume, not in a passing way, but with a softness that lingered. "It suits you," he said, eyes steady, voice low. My stomach flipped. Not from excitement, but confusion. Still, I smiled, changed the subject, and walked away. I told myself not to read too much into it. Maybe he was just being polite. Maybe he didn't mean anything. I didn't know then that I was already standing on the edge of something that could never be undone. It was an ordinary Thursday evening when I came home earlier than expected. The house was unusually quiet. I assumed Daniel was out or asleep. As I headed upstairs, I noticed his bedroom door slightly ajar. I didn't mean to pry, but a faint voice caught my attention. Curious, I paused. Inside, Daniel was on a video call. His shirt was off, his tone soft, almost flirtatious. That alone was surprising, but what froze me in place was hearing my own name slip from his lips. He said it like a secret, with a kind of affection I'd never heard from him before. I backed away quickly, heart pounding. It couldn't be what it sounded like. I told myself I had misheard. Maybe it was about someone else. Maybe it was nothing. But that night, I couldn't sleep. His voice played over and over in my mind. The way he said my name. The way he looked at me recently. The compliments. The sudden maturity. All of it started to feel connected, and none of it felt innocent anymore. The next morning, I couldn't meet his eyes. I avoided conversation. Left the room when he entered, busied myself with anything just to stay away. He noticed. His tone shifted, less playful, more withdrawn. Then came the moment I dreaded. Late one evening, as I sat reading on the couch, he approached and stood silently. I looked up. He didn't hesitate. He confessed he had feelings for me. Not confusion. Not admiration. Feelings. I sat frozen, the words too heavy to process. I told him, firmly but gently, that what he was feeling wasn't love. It was misplaced affection, an emotional mistake that had to stop now. He didn't argue. He only stared, like he'd been expecting rejection but hoping for something else. I asked him to leave the room, and he did, quietly. The silence that followed was thicker than anything I'd ever felt in that house. I felt sick, angry, sad, betrayed. How had we let it get this far? Had I been too friendly? Too open? I began to question everything. The conversations, the glances, even my own intentions. It was a kind of shame that wrapped itself around every memory. I didn't tell Rajiv.
I didn't know how.
How do you explain that your stepson thinks he's in love with you? That somehow, in trying to be a good person, you became the object of an emotion that was completely wrong? I spent the next few days walking on eggshells, avoiding Daniel, while he kept his distance too. But it wasn't over. Not really. We still shared the same house. Every sound, every movement reminded me of what had been said, of what had changed. I knew something had cracked, something that couldn't be mended just by silence. I carried the weight of that night like a secret I couldn't unload. My home no longer felt like a refuge. Every room echoed with discomfort. I started leaving early for work, staying out longer, finding excuses to be anywhere but near Daniel. He no longer attempted conversation. His presence was quiet, but heavy, as if he too was drowning in the consequences of what had happened. The house became a place of avoidance, and Rajiv, as usual, was too busy to notice. He asked if I was feeling tired, if work was stressful. I nodded, grateful he didn't press further. Inside, I was unraveling. I kept asking myself the same question. Had I failed to draw the line early enough? Was my kindness mistaken for something more? I knew the answer didn't matter now. What mattered was salvaging what little remained of our family structure. I wasn't angry at Daniel anymore. I was disappointed, but also aware that he was still young, confused, and dealing with emotions far beyond his maturity. Yet that didn't undo the damage. The sense of betrayal lingered. It had shifted how I looked at him, no longer as a boy growing into a man, but someone who had crossed a boundary that shouldn't have even been approached. One Sunday, during lunch, Daniel broke the silence. He said he was applying for early admission to a university in another city. He wanted to leave by the next semester. Rajiv reacted with pride, unaware of the real reason. I stayed silent, forcing a smile, hiding the relief that washed over me. Daniel didn't look at me directly, but I could sense that he was trying to do the right thing, removing himself from a space that had become too complicated. In the days that followed, I helped him pack. We kept conversations strictly practical. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, just an unspoken agreement to put distance between us. On the day he left, Rajiv hugged him tightly, beaming with fatherly pride. I offered a brief, polite farewell. Daniel glanced at me one last time, a look that carried guilt, sorrow, and something like gratitude. Then he was gone. The house felt empty again, but this time, the silence wasn't peaceful. I tried to resume normal life. Meals, work, errands, all the motions of routine. But inside, I was still processing the loss of something I couldn't name. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't maternal. It was the collapse of a bond that could have remained meaningful had it not been tainted by confusion. I didn't talk about it. Not with friends, not with Rajiv. Some stories don't need telling. Some mistakes are better left as lessons carried quietly. Even so, I couldn't deny how it had changed me. I'd learned how thin the line can be between affection and misinterpretation. How easily good intentions can spiral into regret. I didn't hate Daniel, but I no longer missed him either. What I mourned was trust, once broken, never quite the same. Months passed, and life began to resemble something close to normal. Rajiv remained unaware, and I allowed it that way. I convinced myself there was no point opening wounds that could not heal. Daniel was away, doing well in his university program according to the occasional updates he shared with his father. I kept my distance from those updates, never asking questions, never offering commentary. It was easier to pretend he was just another adult carving his path. I wanted to believe the past had settled, buried under time and distance. But healing isn't always linear. One day, while cleaning out old boxes, I found a handwritten letter. One Daniel must have left behind, hidden under some books in his room. It was addressed to me, but never delivered. I sat down to read it, hesitant. His words were raw and revealing. He admitted he never intended to cross a line, but something about our closeness made him feel seen in ways he hadn't before. He confessed to being confused, ashamed, and deeply sorry for putting me in an uncomfortable position. What struck me most was the honesty. He took full responsibility, without deflection or excuses. I folded the letter quietly and placed it back. I felt no urge to respond or revisit what had happened. But in that moment, something inside softened. Not forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness had already happened in silence, but an acknowledgement that he had grown. Not every story of betrayal ends with destruction. Some simply fade into quiet reflection, teaching us about the fragility of human emotion. Rajiv eventually noticed a change in me. He said I seemed calmer. I didn't explain. Some truths I had learned serve no purpose when spoken aloud. I focused on building back the peace I had lost. I returned to my passions, reconnected with friends, even started teaching a local art class. Slowly, I was reclaiming my space, not from Daniel, but from the uncertainty that had once filled it. That chapter had closed, not with confrontation, but with choice, my choice to not let it define me. Years later, Daniel came home for a visit. He was different, more confident, respectful, and emotionally grounded. Our interaction was brief, but polite. He asked how I'd been. I told him I was well. There was no awkwardness, only a mutual understanding that we had both moved on. He never brought up the past, and neither did I. Some boundaries, once reset, hold firm without reinforcement. Looking back, I see that betrayal doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes it emerges from immaturity, misread signals, or moments of emotional vulnerability. But even then, it leaves a scar, a reminder of how careful we must be with the hearts of others. That experience didn't break me. It made me more aware, more intentional, and far more protective of the peace I now guard so closely. In the end, what mattered wasn't what happened, but how I chose to carry it. Quietly, with grace, and without looking back.